Welcome back yet again. We're going to talk about different kinds of chemical reactions and what do we mean by a chemical reaction. So you got all these different kinds of molecules out there that we said make up the universe, make up our human bodies. And, well, where do these come from? We have to build within our bodies. Your bodies are constantly building bigger molecules from smaller parts. You're breaking down molecules into smaller pieces so that you can use those smaller pieces to build all of the parts of your cells, to harness energy that's stored in those molecules. So how do those types of things happen? Well, you build larger molecules, you break them down through chemical reactions. All right, and so we just said on the last video clip that molecules consist of atoms that are bonded together through different types of chemical bonds. So chemical reactions, when they take place, chemical bonds get formed, rearranged, or broken. Building stuff, breaking it apart, shuffling things around. And a chemical reaction is generally represented as an equation. So something like this, you'll have a molecule A plus a molecule B are put together to make molecule C. That would be the simplest type of representation. So that arrow over here is telling you these are the two things that are reacting with each other, and this is your product. Okay, so these two are reactants. C over here is what you made. Now, a chemical reaction is not always A plus B goes to C. We'll see some different examples of those, but whatever you see before the arrow, those are your reactants, the things that are reacting with each other, and C will be your product. And if you take a chemistry class, you'll learn a whole lot more about that. Like if you have 8 hydrogen atoms in your reactants, well then your products better have 8 hydrogen atoms as well, because atoms don't disappear. They don't go anywhere. They always exist. So you've always got to make sure your accounting works properly. But again, that's beyond the scope of this particular class. Here's an example of some simple chemical equations. If you take 2 hydrogen atoms, those are reactants, and they get covalently bonded together, you now have a molecule of hydrogen gas. So that is a molecule. That's the way hydrogen exists in our atmosphere as well, in this form H2, where you have 2 hydrogen atoms bonded together. Or we were taking a look at methane on the last video lecture. 4 hydrogen atoms plus a carbon atom, they all get bonded together to form CH4. That's methane. So these are your reactants. CH4 is your product. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. Now, those are really simple chemical reactions. There are different types of chemical reactions that take place out there in the world, including in our bodies. And some, like what we just saw, are synthesis reactions. So get used to seeing that term synthesis. That means you're building something. Those are building reactions, combination reactions. You're taking smaller things and bonding them together to make bigger things. Then there are reactions that are called decomposition reactions or breakdown type reactions. And in those, you might be starting with a larger molecule C, and then that gets broken apart into A plus B. So these are actually your products in that case, and then this is your one reactant. So you can have a bigger molecule that gets chopped into 2 smaller pieces. That would be a decomposition reaction. Does that make sense? Because this bigger molecule is decomposing into smaller parts. And we're used to thinking about things like a human body decomposing after it dies. Well, your body is built from molecules, so guess what's happening when your body decomposes? These bigger molecules are getting broken down into smaller molecules, smaller and smaller molecules until your body completely decomposes. Then a third type, exchange reactions. And we'll take a look at an example of an exchange reaction on a later slide. That's where you've got two molecules that are reacting with each other, and like a piece of one moves over to the other one, and a piece of the other one moves over to the other one. So they exchange parts with each other. This is a term you're going to hear a lot about, always, forever, in biology and other clinical type classes, metabolism. When we use the word metabolism, that is the sum of all the chemical reactions that take place in the body. So all these synthesis reactions, these decomposition reactions, and these exchange reactions. If you think about all those together, that's metabolism. So when you hear about somebody with a high metabolism, these chemical reactions that take place in their bodies tend to happen a little more efficiently than somebody who has a lower metabolism. And really, when people are talking about that type of thing, though, it gets into your nutrients that you take in, like your sugars and your fats, these things that we consume from our foods. If your cells break those down more slowly for energy, and you use that energy more slowly, you have a lower metabolism. If your cells break down those types of nutrients more quickly to harness and release energy that you wind up using, then you're said to have a higher metabolism. And if you have a lower metabolism, you tend to store that excess energy that you're not using more easily, so you wind up putting on weight. If you have a higher metabolism, you tend to break down those molecules that have energy in them more quickly, and you use them more quickly, and so you have a tendency not to store them and put on weight. All right, here are some figures from your textbook that are just trying to give you kind of a visual of these different reactions. And again, a lot of times here in biology, you can just think about chemistry almost like you're working with little puzzle pieces, where smaller molecules or smaller little puzzle pieces that are getting linked together to build a bigger puzzle, or you've got strings of beads, and smaller molecules are like beads that are being linked together in a chain to make a string of beads. Sometimes that's all, you got some terminology to learn to associate with those types of images, but a lot of times you can kind of get away with those types of visualizations in these classes. All right, so an example of a synthesis reaction, which you will hear about a lot in biology, would be when you take little smaller molecules that are represented by these brown circles here, and these are called amino acids. We'll be talking about those later. You've no doubt heard of amino acids before. And when they get bonded together in a chain, they form what we call a protein. So amino acids are smaller little molecules. They're the building blocks of bigger molecules called proteins. All right, so this is a type of synthesis reaction. You are building this larger molecule by bonding, covalently bonding, amino acids together. All right, so that's a pretty simplified representation of a synthesis reaction. Decomposition, like I was mentioning, our example here, you have a big molecule, and big molecules have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of atoms. Smaller molecules have fewer atoms that make them up. That's the only difference, and there's lots of variety out there in our bodies. Glycogen is a type of carbohydrate, it's a type of starch that some of the cells in our body use to store energy. So that's a big, giant molecule, and it's built from a bunch of glucose sugar. So we said glucose was a type of sugar molecule. So all glycogen is a bunch of glucose molecules covalently bonded together. So if you break these bonds between the individual glucoses, you wind up with glucose, individual glucoses, as your product. So this would be your reactant, and over here all these glucose molecules are your products. This is a decomposition reaction. You've taken something that's a larger molecule and you've broken it down into smaller pieces. All right, finally, what's an exchange reaction? This is where you've got a part of one molecule moves over to another molecule, or sometimes you'll have the two molecules will, one will donate one thing to the other and the other one donates something else back to the other. So here's an example of an exchange reaction. And this involves some molecules we'll be hearing a lot about this semester. Here's a representation, a very simple representation for a molecule called glucose. And glucose has an oxygen atom right there. That's why they've drawn that like that. And over here is a representation of a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And you're going to hear lots and lots about ATP. If you've ever had a biology class, you learn about that. So this is a pretty large molecule, and in this exchange reaction, each of those P's there stands for phosphate. A phosphate is a phosphorus atom surrounded by 4 oxygen atoms. That's all that stands for. And it's too complicated to draw all that in, so a lot of times in diagrams they don't show that. But if you notice, these are our reactants in our chemical reaction. We got a glucose here, adenosine triphosphate over here. And one of those phosphates, the bond right there, that's a covalent bond between that phosphate and the next one. That one gets broken, and that phosphate winds up attaching to the glucose over here. And our glucose now becomes glucose phosphate, adenosine triphosphate, and we're going to talk more about what adenosine means later. Where you had 1, 2, 3 of those phosphates, now you've only got 2, so it becomes diphosphate. All right, so these were your reactants, and these were your products. And that reaction involved an exchange. This guy sent a phosphate over there, and you did some rearranging between these molecules. That's an exchange reaction. So all 3 of those different chemical reaction types take place in the human body and also out there in the universe. Some other terminology you guys need to become familiar with. Chemistry is heavy on terminology, so start practicing. Well, this whole course is heavy on terminology, so practice sooner rather than later. All these different types of chemical reactions we talked about are classified as either exergonic or endergonic. Ergonic, that suffix, is referring to energy. All right. Exergonic means energy exits. It's released. Energy winds up being released. Okay? Reactions that, when they happen, give off energy are also called catabolic reactions. Okay, the opposite of that, endergonic reactions. Ender means energy, means to put something in, so endergonic means energy in. Ender for in. And those are also called anabolic reactions. Oops, sorry about that. Had a little brief glitch. Okay. All right, and so what do we mean by catabolic reactions? They release energy. Generally, when bonds are broken, these are decomposition or breakdown type reactions. Okay, you break bonds, break especially covalent bonds. All right, so what happens when you have a larger molecule, like let's say you got 2 glucose sugars that are bonded together. If you break that bond between them, I know it's kind of abstract to think about, but covalent bonds store energy. Covalent bonds store energy. Write that down. Covalent bonds store energy. And I know that's hard to visualize. It's kind of abstract type thinking, but that is just the way it works. So when you break a bond, that releases energy. It gives off energy. A lot of that times that energy is in the form of heat. So you know how maybe you remember from a chemistry class back in high school, there were certain chemical reactions you might do where you might dissolve some things in a beaker of water, and the water gets hot when that's happening. That's because you have got an exergonic reaction taking place in that beaker of water. So it's kind of cool when that happens and you can feel that beaker getting warmer. Another good example, when you're exercising, you're using your muscles are breaking down nutrients to power the use of those muscles so that you can run, work out, whatever it is that you're doing. And you know how you get hot, you get overheated? That's because your muscles are breaking down, doing catabolic reactions on your nutrients that you've taken in from your food. And as those bonds are broken, some of that energy gets given off as heat. That's why you overheat when you exercise. All right, the flip side of that, endergonic or anabolic reactions, these are typically your building reactions. These are your synthesis type reactions. Synthesis building reactions require energy input, so they're called endergonic, and anabolic is another name for that. Anabolic, think about like anabolic steroids, heard of those before? Like if some bodybuilders taking anabolic steroids, their muscles build. That's probably an easy way to think of that. And then catabolic is the opposite. That's break down, where things would get smaller. So anytime you build something, just like if you built a building, it takes energy input to make that happen, right? You got to do work to make that happen. And it's the same thing down at the molecule level. If you take two smaller molecules, let's say we got a molecule there and another molecule there, and we want to bond those molecules together to build something larger, it takes energy input to make that happen, to force those smaller molecules to bond together and build something larger. So just get used to thinking about that. Whenever you build something, it takes energy input to make that happen. All right, so you should be familiar with that terminology as well. It'll come up every once in a while. It'll come up in your reading. All right, so that actually concludes that particular lecture. The next one, we're going to start talking about different types of compounds that are important in the human body, and those are divided up into two classifications, inorganic, organic, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the inorganic ones, and then we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the various organic type compounds that compose the human body. So the next video lecture, we're going to start talking about those inorganic compounds.